Carmen Chavez is a distinguished scholar who holds the Bobby and Sherry Patton Professorship and serves as chair of Mexican American and Latino Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Her scholarship is primarily informed by queer of color theory and women of color feminism. Her work emphasizes the rhetorical practices of groups marginalized within existing power structures, but she also attends to rhetoric produced by powerful institutions and actors about marginalized folks and the systems that oppress them, i.e., immigration systems, the prison industrial system, and so on. Her first book, Queer Migration Politics, Activist Rhetoric, and Coalitional Possibilities, which examines coalition building at the many intersections of queer and immigration politics in contemporary United States, was published in 2013. Palestine on Air, a compilation of interviews conducted while hosting a radio show on WRT-FM in Madison, Wisconsin, related to Palestine, was released in 2019. Her latest book, The Borders of AIDS, Race, Quarantine, and Resistance, was released from the University of Washington Press in June 2021 and centers citizenship and immigration status to tell the story about how HIV/AIDS became an opportunity for powerful people in the U.S. to enact alienizing logic against migrants, Black folks, and others. It also shows how the people fought back. She has a number of co-edited volumes, and she is currently working on a collection of essays about our community university collaborations in Madison, called After Ferguson, Black, Queer, Feminist Experiments Against Police and Jails with M. Adams, as well as finishing a book of creative nonfiction essays on race belonging in the Midwestern United States. In addition to her research, she is a regular host of the Latino Studies podcast, Latinx Experts. She co-hosts Feminist Keywords, the podcast companion to Keywords for Gender and Sexuality Studies. On occasion, Professor Chavez serves as host on a public affair on Madison's WORT, one of my favorite radio stations. A principled and modeled engaged scholar, Professor Chavez does not shy away from speaking truth to power, fully aware that power often punches back in an effort to suppress knowledge. Professor Chavez remains steadfast in her commitment to intellectual integrity and public discourse. Her research uncovers and amplifies the voices and strategies of those who resist and challenge oppressive systems, and is more relevant today than at any other time in recent history. Professor Chavez's unwavering dedication to justice and equity makes her work not only impactful, but also profoundly inspiring. My comrade, my friend, welcome.
Thank you for that. And thank you all for coming to Old Home Week. The Haven Trade Center. Amazing to see so many wonderful people who I love in this room. And thank you, Adrian, for all your work making this possible, and graduate research assistant, Armando. Much appreciated. It's awesome to be back in Madison, which always feels like home for some weird reason. I've been gone a while. Snow. But yeah, right now, because there's no snow. So if there was snow, I would remember. So let me. The QR code there is an accessibility copy, so if it's useful for you to read along, and it'll come up throughout the presentation. And if you decide at a certain point, God dang, she's hard to listen to, then you'll have a chance again. Right now. Yeah, so I'm happy to be here. This is some, I'm a department chair, and I do a lot of work with Faculty of Center for Justice in Palestine and American Association of University Professors, which means I'm hardly a scholar nowadays. But so this is like kind of long form work that I'm trying to eventually get a book out of. And it's a little bit maybe experimental. So I welcome your comments, critiques, questions, and complaints. All right, so I'm gonna jump in here. When I was a kid in the late '80s, I lived in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska, nestled behind a thin cedar-lined gravel lane, set back 100 yards off the main gravel road. Oldest of 5, these were the days of government cheese, preschool lunches, and garage sale clothes for my family. And so when it came to entertainment, we made it up. 4 miles from the nearest town, which didn't have a movie theater or a skating rink or any of the other activities we couldn't have afforded anyway. So our lives were constituted by make-believe. We ducked in and out of muddy cornfields as the thick grassy leaves hung limply from the stalks and scratched our faces as we chased each other as cops and robbers. We crawled atop the rickety galvanized steel sheds my dad had crafted from used lumber and his grit, and taunted the crop dusters that flew low overhead. And we'd walk to the end of the lane out by the mailbox and gather the large rocks that had collected near the ditch after the maintainer cleared the roads. With these rocks, we'd stand before the ditch opposite our lane, facing the crop field and across from a tall wood electrical pole. And my brothers and I would begin our competition, seeing who could strike the pole the most times with the big rocks. My brothers appeared to have a strategy. Ben, with the weakest arm, would go for the bigger rocks, hoping the weight of the large rocks would compensate for his speed and accuracy. Jake, though 3.5 years younger than me, was already as strong as I was, believed the aerodynamics of a smooth, round, medium-sized rock would lead him to victory. And as for me, 10 years old and with the best dexterity, I opted to rely on my skill, worrying less about size and shape, focusing on my aim. We could throw rocks at that pole for what seemed like hours, making and breaking rules for competition as we tried to get the advantage over the others. When we'd tire of this game, we'd go on to the next. I don't know if Mom knew that this is one of our pastimes, or if she did what she thought about it. I can imagine that she probably wouldn't have been happy, if not because of the worry that we might turn our rocks on each other, and then because we played this game on the main road where cars sped by at 50 miles an hour, unused to anything in their way. But we never turned the rocks on each other, maybe because we knew we could hurt each other, or maybe because no conflict ever drove us to it. A couple times every summer, my dad would pack our tents and blankets, life jackets, and fishing poles. And my mom would load hot dogs, chips, marshmallows, and other food items into a cooler that we kids would load up in the back of the truck, and Dad would drive us the 50 miles down to Harlan County Reservoir for 1 or 2 nights of camping. Dad would back the pickup into a spot as close to the water as he could find, and they would set up camp, screaming at us to wait to go to the water until one of them could join us. Mom would set up some blankets on the shore and bring our towels, and we would splash each other and play beneath the hot summer sun. We didn't have a boat or any water toys, and so inevitably, when we started to get bored, Dad would call us to the shore, a pile of thin rocks at his bare feet. "You guys want to skip some rocks?" My dad was an expert rock skipper. He could make a good-sized flat rock skip 5 or 6 times before it dunked beneath the surface. He showed us the way you had to hold the rock in your hand, palm up, rock held delicately between forefinger and thumb, bend your knees to get close to the water surface. After we depleted his pile, dunking each rock with maybe a skip or 2, he'd chide us to get into the shallow water and collect a bunch of flat rocks. Harlan County was flush with smooth black rocks that Dad said were perfect for skipping. Once we'd fought each other for the best rocks and put them in tidy piles at our feet, we'd get started skipping rocks. Dad would move from kid to kid, correcting our form and making a huge deal out of it when we got 3 skips. "Wow, I think you're going to be better than me," he'd say with a toothy grin. This was all the encouragement we'd need to keep searching for flat rocks, making our piles, and going for another round.
So these glimpses from some of my childhood experiences with throwing rocks, as mundane as they are, reflect a very human experience. In fact, one might describe them as a fundamental human experience. Evolutionary anthropologist Richard W. Young argues that the throwing grip and the clubbing grip are the two fundamental human grips and are central to understanding how human evolution is connected to tool behavior. In blunt terms, early hominoids would rise to the top of their respective hierarchies if they mastered the arts of throwing and clubbing. Not only were they better equipped to fight off adversaries, but they were better suited to kill their prey and eat to survive. Although in my family we threw rocks for recreation, we were, by this theory, participating in the most human of experiences, perhaps the human experience that characterizes us as human. What interests Young is how the uptake of tools led to processes of natural selection wherein those who better adapted to being able to use certain tools had better life chances and therefore more opportunities for passing these traits to offspring. I'm not interested in the evolutionary thrust of Young's argument, but I am thinking about it as a kind of starting point to consider how it is that certain tools have both been taken up by humans and how humans have, across time and place, assigned meaning to these various tools. I'm going to leave the question of clubbing aside for now and focus on the question of throwing. For ancient humans, throwing had utility toward survival, as taking up an object as a weapon and being able to hurl it at your enemy or your prey ensured your dominance. For contemporary humans, while we retain the ability to grip and throw, with technological advancements in weaponry, a single body with the capacity to throw provides little protection at all. So while the capacity to grip and throw remain fundamental experiences of an able-bodied version of humanity, at least in trace form, those who lack the technology to do anything other than throw are at a fundamental disadvantage in most conflict scenarios. Nevertheless, it seems to be that the equally fundamental human experience of experiencing the thrower of an object as a threat has, at least in conflict scenarios, remained part of human understanding. This makes sense in an interpersonal conflict. To be hit with a flying object hurled at your body hurts, and it can, in rare circumstances, do lethal damage. But in a militarized space, the one who can only hurl an object is structurally weak. I've long had in mind a project about what the anthropologist James C. Scott calls weapons of the weak, and the way that these become common sense justifications for state violence. Now, that idea might seem too obvious to you, and it may very well be, but let me explain how I'm using Scott's idea. So in his landmark 1985 study of Malaysian peasants, Scott argues that formal organized political activity, even if clandestine and revolutionary, is typically the preserve of the middle class and the intelligentsia. To look for peasant politics in this realm is to largely look in vain. He argues that most peasant resistance stops well short of collective defiance. It's more in the vein of foot dragging, dissimulation, desertion, false compliance, pilfering, feigned ignorance, slander, arson, sabotage, and so on. They require little or no coordination or planning, make use of implicit understandings and informal networks. They often represent a form of individual self-help. They typically avoid any direct symbolic confrontation with authority. Now, importantly, Scott and I use the word weak simply to describe a relationship to power, not a person's inherent status or capacity. Scott's interest in peasant resistance has limitations for the way I want to take up this concept, which is less to talk about what poor farmers in rural areas do, but to think perhaps more expansively about those who are oppressed and repressed by states and who may spontaneously, or as a matter of righteous ritual, take up weapons that pale in comparison to what the state has at its disposal, or even those who may just have such a weapon on their person. Unlike Scott, I'm thinking about acts performed with tools that can sometimes be described as defiant, but not necessarily so. I first thought of this idea in relation to two instances of state violence that I and many of you heard about in 2015 and 2016. And I want to just share the genealogy of my thinking because I think it helps to demonstrate the fact that the question of a defiant agency doesn't have to be present. Because what I am, I think, primarily interested in is the way that the weapon or the tool possessed by the weak, regardless of that person's intent, becomes the alibi for disproportionate state violence. This is not to say that powerful states need an alibi right, to perpetrate state violence. But powerful state actors, often provide one when they enact violence. The alibi allows them to offer a rationale of self-defense, fear, or the unspecified threat of bodily harm. In the U.S. context, we're perhaps most accustomed to such defenses emerging when a police officer believes he sees a gun. This defense is often understandable to a liberal public, even if infuriating, when the weapon turns out to be a toy, a wallet, or some other obviously non-lethal object. Sometimes such defenses are also considered understandable if the gun was fired when, say, police mistakenly enter the wrong dwelling, or when cops prematurely fire as someone holds a gun in order to turn it over or reveal its legal presence. Now, I'm not in this talk really interested in guns, for while guns are weapons that what I'm describing as weak people possess, guns are inherently meant to be powerful, lethal weapons. So, kind of that aside, let me briefly share these origins of my thinking, not only because I think it'll help you understand my thinking, but I think it'll give you some useful grounds to offer some criticism in the project. All right, so on Wikipedia tells us, there's a reason I'm citing on April 21st, 2015, Freddie Carlos Gray Jr., the 25-year-old African-American man, was arrested by the Baltimore Police Department for possessing what the police alleged was an illegal switchblade. While being transported in a police van, Gray fell into a coma and was taken to a trauma center. Now, when I originally started this may be different now. What I just read to you was the first thing that you would read if you Google Freddie Gray's name. Now, other perhaps more reliable sources note that it is unclear why he was originally arrested. While he had a knife, by most definitions of a switchblade, his knife was not one. Nonetheless, he was arrested, taken for a ride to the county jail in a police van with 6 officers who made 2 stops along the way, which are in no way documented with visual or audio footage. While he asked for his inhaler in the van, no one seems to be able to explain how he suffered 3 fractured vertebrae and a crushed voice box, injuries that later killed him. In spring 2016, Officer Edward Nero, one of the 6 officers involved, was found not guilty of all charges against him. The others followed him being acquitted or not even tried. He sobbed upon hearing the verdict. Even the attorney representing Gray's family, Billy Murphy, applauded the decision, CNN reports, saying you can't convict people unless you know the evidence. Of course, the lack of evidence exists because the state actors who killed Gray willfully or intentionally neglected to gather and provide it. What we do know is that a young Black man with asthma and a small knife entered a police van with 6 police officers and left in a body bag. What we also know is that those same 6 police officers utilized the presence of a small knife in the pocket of a 5'8", 145-pound young Black man with asthma as a significant enough threat that warranted his state murder. A year later, in April 2016, private security guards working for the Israeli government at the Kalandia checkpoint in between Ramallah in the West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem shot dead 2 Palestinian siblings who, according to occupation forces, wielded knives, with the elder sister, Marm Hassan Abu Ismail, age 23, reportedly hurling a knife at Israeli forces. The kitchen knife she allegedly threw, and a, quote, Leatherman-style multi-tool discovered in her 16-year-old brother, Ibrahim Saleh Taha's belt, were allegedly recovered at the scene. The officers reportedly told them to stop several times before firing at and killing both when the knife was apparently thrown. But several bystanders reported that the officers were under no threat when they fired shots, and that the siblings appeared not to understand orders given to them in Hebrew. Taha apparently attempted to take his sister's hand and walk her away when shots were fired, and was himself shot when he went to her aid, said eyewitnesses. Some 203 Palestinians were killed between October 25th, 2015 and May 2016. Most, according to the Israel Army, while carrying out knife, gun, or car ramming attacks against Israelis. One can safely assume that knives and car ramming were far more prevalent than guns, given the Israeli-imposed limitations on Palestinian agency in the West Bank. And in this instance, as with the case of Freddie Gray, the presence of minor weaponry used in what bystanders described as a non-lethal way becomes the justification for lethal state violence. Now, these things happen in part because of an application of common sense. Gramsci, of course, defines common sense as beliefs that people arrive at not through their own thinking exactly, but because certain ideas are presented as timeless, self-evident truths. We might also think of common sense as here's some of these words, right? An internal sense, natural, ordinary, rational, practical, concern with the everyday, thinking about the capacity for good judgment, etc. In thinking of common sense, we must think of the commons or the public, the take it for granted, right, when it comes to evaluating judgment. The knife becomes an important common sense alibi in both of these cases above. The knife, a weapon of the structurally weak, is no deadly threat compared to a gun, but it becomes the lethal grounds for the common sense action of state-sanctioned murder. Bystander accounts, lack of footage, and crushed spines become subsumed in that which, from the viewpoint of the nation state and its militarized arms, is natural, normal, ordinary, shared, and protective of those who belong to the state's project. Thinking with common sense to understand these state-sanctioned murders, we're able to see not merely the sort of transparent realism the nation state uses in its defense of itself, but the transparency of the necropolitical strategy by which those who are not part of the public, the general, the shared, are marked for facile and justifiable murder. All right. So that's where I began this project, was kind of these case studies, really trying to think through them. I was already thinking about common sense in another context. And so I remain really interested in the broad ways that common sense prevails as the dominant way of justifying the lethal state violence perpetrated in the presence of a weapon of the structurally weak. But as I've been thinking about this over the years, and it really has been a long time now that I've been thinking about this, I've become interested in this phenomenon, specifically in militarized border zones, and especially Mexico, US, and Palestine, Israel, because I've seen a persistent pattern of what I'm describing in such spaces due, at least in part, to the globalization of such spaces in terms of tactics and technology. And I continue to return to what I've come to think of as one of the quintessential weapons of the week, the act of rock. And considering the simple fact of throwing a rock to protest militarized borders, I'd come to think not just the fundamental experience that is learning to grip and throw, but about what Raymond Williams calls structures of feeling. Now, let me be clear. I'm not even sure I fully understand Williams' concepts, so welcome your feedback. But let me try to articulate it as I understand it. So Williams was interested in how certain conventions and genres come to dominate in artistic writing. And he was also interested in the limitations of Gramsci's theory of hegemony, suggesting that beyond mass conformity to common sense, there must be internal modes of thinking and feeling that lead to creativity, or at least to other modes of being and doing. So in this way, structures of feeling name what exists in interstitial spaces that can't be dictated by norms, conventions, genres, law, policy, and the like. What are the structures of feeling that animate those repressed and brutalized in militarized border zones? I'm still considering this question, and I can't say that I have concrete answers, but one thing I keep returning to is rage. In a lot of contexts right now, actually. So it's not that I think that rage can encapsulate all the feelings for people who throw rocks in these spaces. I think some are engaging in recreation. Some get caught up in the moment. Some are utterly joyful, and others are full of righteous fucking rage. But rage as a feeling can become a site from which we begin to understand the creation of resistive cultures that are felt before they're rationally articulated. This is a lesson that Black and women of color feminists taught us well. I'm interested in rage because despite all the ways that the rage of women and other oppressed peoples gets understood in dominant discourse, I agree with Soraya Chemaly that anger can be a really rational response to what the oppressed face. I've also long been persuaded by Audre Lorde's, which is putting her quote up here, is that anger expressed and translated into action in the service of our vision and our future is a liberating and strengthening act of clarification. And I have for decades now never forgotten the power of Bell Hooks' opening line to Killing Rage, Ending Racism. I am writing this essay sitting beside an anonymous white male that I long to murder. Oh. I love that for the way that she, in the spirit of Lorde, harnesses rage for the end of understanding racist oppression and for the possibility of liberatory will-making. These efforts are signaled in Karen Kaplan, Sarah Haley, and Dubra Mitra's introduction to the Rage special issue of Signs, when they write, "Rage can be a public expression of mourning, a mode of survival, and a project of creating new social futures." There's so much utility and power and resourcefulness in rage, but it is also the case that when rage manifests in the actions of the oppressed, whether in looting, rebelling, rock throwing, screaming, marching, or any number of other activities, it can be and often is used as a common sense justification for state violence. Importantly, the rage of the oppressed, when manifested in the wielding of a weapon of the weak, is not the only common sense justification for state violence. As mentioned above, state violence occurs in ordinary ways without any catalyst at all, and it also occurs in response to lethal threats, and it occurs in response to whatever weapons the weak happen to utilize, or rather, what the weak take up becomes the justification for state violence. And I think that it's also a particular thing in interrogating. So let me dig into some of the specific ways I'm thinking about rock throwing in militarized border zones through a couple of examples. So on November 1st, 2018, as several caravans of migrants made the dangerous journey through Central America and Mexico toward the United States to flee. What are they fleeing? Everything. Climate change, homophobia, transphobia, poverty, other political and social violences after decades of imperial meddling by countries like ours. Donald Trump, our good friends, gave an address on immigration and border security. And like most of his public speeches on the topic, this one rambled on about the drugs and violence these hordes of quote-unquote illegal aliens brought with them in their attempts to penetrate our sacred national body. After his speech and in response to a reporter's question about whether the military that Trump had called to protect the border would be firing on these people that were coming north, Trump replied, "I hope not. I hope there won't be, but anybody throwing stones, rocks like they did to the Mexican military, police, and soldiers of Mexico, we will consider that a firearm, because there's not much difference when you get hit in the face with a rock." And, you know, it was very violent a few days ago, very, very violent. It was a break-in. It was a break-in to the country. They broke into Mexico. Isn't it good to just read his stuff out loud? It's important that we don't clean it up. It's not like I'm worried. God, that was like 7 years ago. Okay. The migrant caravans in 2018, by the way, were largely peaceful. But Trump referred to an October 28th incident when one caravan clashed with police along the Mexico-Guatemala border and threw sticks or rocks at them in response. Now, the only reported violence that occurred was the death of one migrant in this conflict, and though the cause of the death is unclear, and there were injuries to several others. Trump repeatedly used the phrase break-in to describe the caravan's movements and confrontations with law enforcement and military position Mexico.
rephrase that. Trump repeatedly used the phrase break-in to describe the caravan's movements and confrontations with law enforcement and military, positioned Mexico and by proxy the United States as homes vulnerable to invasion. Now, Trump, in his classic demonizing of everything in the shithole countries of the global South, went on to lament the weak police and military in Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico for their failures to keep these people at bay when the U.S. pays them so much to do so, presumably referring to the strong armed agreements the U.S. made with Mexico to stop migrants at its southern border and to stall those migrants in northern border towns who made it through the country. He later put a finer point on his comments after another question about whether he really meant that the military should fire on rock throwers. And he said, "We will consider that. The maximum we can consider that because they are throwing rocks viciously and violently. You saw that 3 days ago, really hurting the military. We will not put up with that." I don't think he meant that. If they want to throw their rocks at our military will fight back. I told them to consider it a rifle. When they throw rocks like they did at the Mexican military and police, I say consider it a rifle. Now, Trump's words echo the words of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who in 2015, as Israel issued new rules for punishing rock throwing, proclaimed, "Rocks and firebombs are lethal weapons. They kill and have killed. Those who try to harm us, we will harm them." Boy, ain't that the truth. Keep in mind, in the entire history of Israel, only 14 people have ever been documented as being killed by a rock. And at least one of those was actually a concrete block dropped from a bridge atop a car. As I mentioned above, rock throwing is a good example of how I immediately use Scott's concept of the weapons of the weak. Rock throwing's place in popular imaginaries worldwide no doubt stems from the biblical story of David and Goliath, in which David, a young boy and sheep herder, takes down the gigantic and powerful Goliath by slinging a rock into his forehead, knocking him unconscious to the ground so the boy can kill Goliath with his own sword. The story of David and Goliath is a legendary parable for all triumphs of the weak over the powerful. Yet the powerful, as Trump's comments make plain, often use the rarely fatal act of resistance as the rationale for state violence, including the use of firearms. Despite that, the United Nations' basic principles on the use of force and firearms by law enforcement insist that law enforcement use firearms against people only against the imminent threat of death or serious injury. Now, as the media firestorm over his comments bubbled, Trump, as he's wont to do, backtracked on his comments, stating he only meant that rock throwers should be arrested, not shot. Nevertheless, by then, the heavily armed Nigerian army had already used his words to justify fatal shootings of Islamic Shiite protesters who threw rocks at them. Now, there's actually very little substantive scholarly work about the politics of throwing stones, and even fewer in my primary discipline of rhetoric and communication. Yet the Defiant Act is regularly a preoccupation of colonial, imperial, and otherwise repressive governments like the U.S., Israel, and India. It's often the subject of media attention, despite its real and allegoric status as a non-lethal action of use in the politically weak. It is often used as a rationale for state violence, including maiming and murdering. So, working on this book, I'm planning to discuss a bunch of different instances of rock throwing to theorize these kinds of relationships between material rhetoric, defiance, and state violence. The responses that I'm going to consider include what happened to the late Edward Said, a Palestinian at the time, Columbia University professor. He threw a rock from Lebanon toward its border with Israel during a visit in July 2000. Plan to look at the discourse surrounding Border Patrol agent Lonnie Swartz's killing of 16-year-old Jose Antonio Elena Rodriguez for allegedly throwing rocks from Nogales, Sonora, Mexico at agents on the U.S. side in 2012. And the iconic image of Faris Odeh, 14-year-old Palestinian boy throwing a rock at an Israeli tank, his subsequent killing by IOS during the Second Intifada, and the ways that Israel's crackdown on stone throwing since, and so much more to say there. But so for the last bit here, I want to talk a little bit about Said.
So this is this kind of iconic image here of Said. So on July 3rd, 2000, the renowned Columbia University professor and Palestinian intellectual, the late Edward Said, was with his family on the southern border of Lebanon that connects him with Israel. In late May of that year, Israeli troops, which had occupied southern Lebanon for 18 years, finally withdrew. Said had not been to the region since 1982, when Israel began its invasion of Lebanon. Certainly, this must have been an emotional time for Said. Born in Jerusalem in 1935, and whose family home was annexed by Israel in 1948. To be standing on land now free from occupation must have been a powerful experience. But that land was still a border zone, and when Israel left, it erected a barbed wire fence, and just on the other side of that wire fence sat an Israeli watchtower. Since the withdrawal, it reportedly had been customary for Arabs to visit the southern border to throw rocks at that fence. For most of the day, Said and his family spent time in the Al Qaim prison, where Lebanese resistance fighters had been held in horrible condition, treated terribly. Said spoke to the former prisoners about their experiences. And Said, whose mother was half Lebanese, undoubtedly connected with their stories and their plight. And afterwards, he drove to the border village of Kafr Kila. There he joined a crowd of people, elated at the lack of Israeli forces there, several who threw stones at the barbed wire. Now, here the emotion that seems to compel the act of stone throwing appears to be something like ecstasy. But there's little doubt that ecstasy was also constituted by deep-seated rage about living under occupation. In a statement, Said wrote, "For a moment I joined in. The spirit of the place infected everyone with the same impulse to make a symbolic gesture of joy that the occupation had ended. So he too threw a rock toward the fence. As Said put it, one stone tossed into an empty space scarcely warrants a second thought. But perhaps the world's most well-known Palestinian intellectual should have known that even the most benign act of Palestinian resistance will be met with woefully unequal response. As numerous commentators and Palestinians alike have remarked, the stone has become a symbol of the Palestinian struggle against Israeli occupation, violence, and apartheid. It is an act of rageful defiance in the face of overwhelming oppression. To Israel, it is an unequivocally provocative act. For decades, the simple act of hurling a stone has become the unquestioned justification for high-tech Israeli aggression against Palestinians. A photographer captured Said just before he tossed the rock, and shortly thereafter, a firestorm erupted. A columnist in the Columbia Student newspaper wrote about Said's rock throwing alongside his meeting with a leader from Hezbollah. It's unfortunate that perhaps our best-known professor has chosen to publicly support a known terrorist whose organization is responsible for hundreds of deaths. He can hide behind his reputation no longer. His repugnant terrorist sympathies are exposed. Shame on you, Edward Said. Boy, we're hearing a lot of resonance, right? Although Columbia University refused to comment on the outside activities of its faculty, if only, it supported Said's right to academic freedom. Man, how far we've come. The controversy continued. Some months later, letters poured into the American Association of University Professors publication, Academe, lambasting Columbia's and the AAUP's defense and urging for Said's removal. One wrote, "Would Columbia or the AAUP support a racist faculty members throwing a stone through the window of a Black newspaper on campus?" Another decried, "I would be surprised if either Columbia or the AAUP would protect my right to throw rocks at its administration building. There's a difference between free speech and violent acts, although in the case of Edward Said, neither Columbia University nor the AAUP seems to recognize the difference." And still another posed, "Since I am indeed a professor, could I go and throw rocks at Mr. Jonathan Knight, the AAUP's associate secretary, or the AAUP's distinguished secretary, general secretary, Mary Bergen? Will the AAUP promise not to press charges if I do so?" Now, I think each of these comments is interesting in the argument by analogy that they employ. And so I'm going to spend some time kind of unpacking this. So in argumentation theory, an argument by analogy is only effective if the two cases being compared are similar enough to make the argument credible. So it's worth parsing for a moment what's being compared. So we'll start out with case one, our control case. Edward Said is a tenured professor and a Palestinian who threw a rock toward a barbed wire fence on a national border and Israeli soldiers on the other side of that border, but neither property nor person was damaged. No one present claimed that Said targeted an individual, and it's unclear whether the rock he threw crossed the border or landed on Lebanese soil. Okay, so that's the control case. So in the first example, the letter writer asks whether a racist professor throwing a rock through the window of a black newspaper would be treated as Said has been treated. Right. So in this case, Said is compared with a racist professor. A broken window on university property is compared to a barbed wire fence on a national border. And black journalists are the equivalent of armed Israeli soldiers who recently withdrew from Lebanon. In other words, Said is a racist. A rock landing near a border is the same as crashing through a window, and Israeli soldiers are as oppressed as black journalists in the United States. This case holds some common sense merit in the dominant imaginary of the United States, where Palestinians and critics of Israel are frequently named as racists or anti-Semites, and Israelis, though not necessarily soldiers, are often positioned as an oppressed group vis-a-vis critics of the state of Israel and against the rest of the Middle East. Now, in case two, a white male emeritus professor of physics at a public research university asked whether Columbia and the AAUP would defend him for throwing rocks at either's administration building. So now in this case, the white male professor is Said, the administration building is the national border, and the AAUP in Columbia are the Israeli soldiers. Unlike the last case, this one offers no analysis of differing power dynamics or politics whatsoever. Now in the third case, the author, a math and computer science professor, asks whether he can throw rocks directly at two employees of the AAUP without repercussion. In this case, the math professor is Said. The rock thrown at the national border is a rock thrown at the bodies of two organizational leaders, and the two leaders are the Israeli soldiers. As in the previous case, the analogy holds little to no credibility without an analysis of power and politics. Now, why is it so important to spend so much time, like I would do in my intro to argumentation class, right? Parsing the logic and assumptions of each of these arguments by analogy. These pithy examples have much to tell us about how Palestinians and by extension other colonized peoples are viewed. They have equally as much to suggest to us about predominant theories of violence and understandings of the national borders of powerful nation states. Moreover, they seem to suggest that the emotions of the structurally powerful are equal to those of the structurally oppressed. This is the same common sense logic that's led to things like bans on DEI, CRT, and Black studies, which are all at least purportedly catalyzed by the bad feelings of conservative white students who are angry because they feel silenced and censored and otherwise ostracized by education that deals with power, history, and culture. So, in this next project, I want to begin with the act of rock throwing. An act that is often used as a tool of defense or aggression or resistance, but that reflects what some have called non-lethal violence. As non-lethal forms of violence, it should stand to reason that the state would respond with equal force. But instead, this weapon of the weak is often met with disproportional force that's violent, life or livelihood threatening, and lethal. I'm especially interested in these acts as manifestations of particular emotions that signal structures of feeling that may prefigure more coordinated forms of collective resistance. This is to reiterate feminist lessons about rage and anger, in particular that name these emotions as powerful, rational, and useful. And while I do think ordinary police encounters could be another site with which to examine these ideas, the particular and contested nature of border zones and the ways that common sense about protecting the national body is so heightened there is of particular interest for an investigation into how these weapons of the weak become facile common sense justifications for state violence. But let me bookend this with where I began, rock throwing as recreation. Well, I didn't get to the joyful dimensions very much in this paper. There's a little bit there with Said, right? If a deep argument of this paper is that rock throwing is fundamental to what it means to be human, it's worth thinking. It's worth, I think, returning to a different emotional register in which that happens. So kind of thinking about this range of stuff. Right? My brother Ben has 3 really incredible little kids. And unlike the childhood he and I shared, he has the financial resources to entertain his kids in ways he and I never had access to. This past summer, I stood near the boat dock on Harlan County Reservoir, waiting for him to bring his decent-sized motorboat. Right? We've ascended Maritimes. From the floating garage he pays to store it in. As I waited with my nibblings and my dad, the kids played. The oldest in her kayak, the next one in her paddleboard, and the youngest in his life vest, methodically helping the girls move their rafts from shore and out to the water. My dad, a non-alcoholic beer in his hand and dressed in a ragged t-shirt and cut-off jean shorts, walked around the beach collecting flat black rocks. When he had sufficient rocks, he picked up one in his right hand and tossed it toward the water away from the kids. Whoa, Grandpa, you skipped 4 times, the oldest raised. The little one raced over to my dad. Grandpa, let me try, he said, finding the biggest rock in the pile and throwing it straight to water. In a couple minutes, both girls had docked their rafts. Find your rocks, kids, Grandpa encouraged. The oldest dictated to her younger siblings about which rocks would work and shook her head when she saw them with a rock with too much girth. Just like we did as kids, they all put little piles beside their feet, and I did the same. As my brother slowly rolled into the dock, we skipped rocks, or the kids tried to, Dad encouraging them with each throw. It was a very humanizing experience. I'm not trying to compare my family's recreational tossing of rocks to the dire situation migrants or occupied people face. We throw rocks in exponentially different contexts with exponentially different consequences. It goes without saying. But I bet our bodies feel similarly, even if the emotion that animates the picking up of the rock, the setting it between our fingers, the stance we take with our legs, the reaching of our shoulders behind our trunks, and the forward motion of our arms as the rock releases from our fingers is different. And the truth is, in these political times, what we have is us, my friend Jesus Sayas constantly reminds me. And any ways that we can remind ourselves of our connections to other humans is worthwhile. So I'm going to end it there.
Hi, Dr. Chavez. Thank you for this. My name is Agnat. I'm a PhD student in the Educational Policy Studies Department and a recovering Texan. When you talk about rock throwing, you talked about it a lot as a moment situated in a spontaneous act of rage.
Yeah.
Does your analysis change when the rage is protracted or sustained over a long period of time, or when the act is premeditated?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an awesome question. For example, you think about the 2018 right of return marches, where it was part of the symbolic ritual, right? That's what people knew they were doing, going to the border with Israel, throwing rocks. So I think there's going to be a definite need to think through the different emotional registers in the different contexts. I think I sort of enter into it thinking through the spontaneous moment. But I mean, in a lot of these situations, it's much more complex than that. So I think it'll get more refined as I'm moving through the different case studies. Thank you. Yeah, great question.
Right. I have a lot of thoughts, questions. One, maybe we'll follow up on this and ask if there's anxiety is also one emotion that maybe is involved in, especially if it's premeditated, maybe you got to throw it in other consequences. I don't know if it's an emotion.
That's a great question about the range of emotions. So I have a guest research assistant who just got to Austin from Gaza in the fall. We got connected, and so she's helping me on this project just while she, gets settled. And so I've talked to her a bit about the different ranges of emotions because, she said to me, she said, we grew up believing that Palestinians invented rocks. And I was like, I love that. It's so, because you actually maybe did, right? In a certain sense, right? If it's like what we go into them, but part of her point, right, is there's this whole gamut of ways that people experience this act because it's so integral to the identity.
Yeah. So I also grew up in the Palestinians exploring, and not only the Palestinians, the children.
Yeah.
Right. So I think, and presenting every part of your talk, right? That this rock drawing being associated childhood, thinking with, I don't know, I was thinking about natural childhood about the idea of unchilding and the rock that becomes a rifle, right? Like it's perfectly put together. And then I was thinking, Israeli soldiers are also children.
They're also children. Yeah.
And how can you, like, I think a big part of making children into soldiers is that you can trust that they will not be rational, whatever, right enough to So I don't know.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about children these days, so maybe that's why.
Yeah, I hadn't really been thinking about the converse of that, the Israeli. I mean, obviously, I've been there and know that, but yeah, I need to think through that too, because I think you're exactly right. But we'll talk more.
Yeah, not just.
Thanks, Dan.
Are you thinking of rocks and stones as a technology of resistance?
I think eventually I will have some theorizing behind me that suggests that. But I, other than that kind of rudimentary, I think there's a line I dropped in there where I said something like that. That's about as far as I got on that.
Gotcha. Because there's I'm really interested in STS, and there's an interesting relationship between the technology developed by the oppressive force and those who are being oppressed, the dialectical nature of it. And my favorite example of this is drones, predator drones, kind of first popular in usage, popularized. We'll stick with that word. By Obama, are famously ineffective. Like there's even a modicum of a opposing air force. They're actually particularly ineffective in the case in which the population that they're targeting are able to defend themselves. They're developed with that intent.
Interesting.
And so, like, the technology available to those who are being oppressed is kept in mind, and those who are trying to develop the technologies for that direction. And so I just wanted to call that out as maybe a opportunity for investigation.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you.
No worries.
I should let you do.
If we could take a question from our virtual audience. Ale asks Dr. Chavez, could you share your thoughts about how rock throwing can be considered or not as part of youth civic engagement?
That's a great question. What if we considered it that, right? I mean, and that's part of what, I don't know if the juxtaposition between the kind of personal narrative and the, instances where we're seeing state violence or even if it's just like threats, like say it's not state violence exactly, but they want to go for his job, right? So I don't know if I'll keep that juxtaposition, but part of what I am trying to do there, right, is to signal the different registers. And And I think there's a lot of the activity of marginalized youth that gets framed as criminal. That what a different world it would be, and if it was framed as civic activity, because it is. Great question.
Thanks. That was really wonderful. It was so great to weave the personal and the whole discussion about rock throwing and clubbing. And I do want to hear more about the clubbing into that. I have a couple of comments for you to consider as you're developing this. And maybe part of it relates to this last question that was raised. Because there was a time when rock throwing was viewed as kind of civic engagement. That is the 60s, 70s movements of students, college students in the United States. And, Kent State stands out for the atrocity of using bullets against students protesting. And that is really significant, I think, because it highlights part of what I want to talk about here is that I love the way you talked about common sense, because common sense is I really have found it problematic for people to talk about common sense without recognizing the way that it is a distillation of dominant discourse, that it represents the normative, that it represents the hegemonic agreement, that who is included in the common is not actually the everyday people, right? That common sense operates at a different level. But I think that what is needed maybe in thinking about what you're doing is addressing how common sense is racialized. It is a racialized common sense, because who is outside the common is violence can be wielded against. Yeah. And what makes the Kent State stand out so much then in thinking about it is you can't wield violence against young white college protesters in the Midwest. That's the atrocity. But you can wield it against who else, right? So that regimes of racialized common sense are operating, and I think that part, the racialization there, isn't yet in your presentation. And although, like, thinking about what Lauren is raising, the relationship between anger and racialization as well. So I wonder what you think about that, about adding in that dimension of thinking about how racialization also determines both common sense and who is protected by or subject to state violence.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's absolutely central in both. I mean, if I'm thinking primarily U.S., Mexico, and Palestine, Israel, in both cases, it's the common sense is 100% racialized, and it's also, I mean, it's not just racialized. It's also about class formations, and and I think it just needs to pull that out. Absolutely. Well, thank you for bringing.
Yeah, no, your talk was really got me thinking a lot about it. So it was really good, great,
Awesome.
great ideas.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for an amazing talk. I've got a couple of points that follow on from a couple of previous questions. So I've got two interconnected points that lead to questions. So I hope you'll bear with me. The first one is I was trying to think about some of the parallels in the global north to what you were talking about, and it strikes me that to some extent the equivalent to the rock is the cobblestone. So, for example, going back to the 60s and 70s, I was actually thinking of France rather than America, because you have that famous slogan from May 68 in France, "Sous la pavle playa." Sorry, I don't speak French. Apologies, the pronunciation is bad, but beneath the paving stones of the beach. And the point is here that you're articulating resistance. You're articulating this notion of ripping up the paving stones in order to get to some sort of future utopian society. And so the question here is, how is the emotional structure of the act articulated to some sort of sense of future or past? Because I feel like in the current moment, when we talk about populism, so often the emotional structure is articulated to the past and visions of the past. Here we're actually seeing potentially an act and a moment of resistance and a moment of anger articulated to a vision of the future. And I found that very interesting. So I just wanted to sort of see what you thought about that. And also because, is it the case that resistance today actually maybe that's far less possible today because generally when people are throwing rocks, they don't have much hope that we're going to get towards some future society, but it's an act of desperation rather than actual hopeful resistance. So that's the first thing. And I was just wondering how you thought about temporality almost, if you like, in the way emotions work. The second thing is it's going back to the Lord quote. And it's going back to this a question which I had, which was about some of the conceptual anchoring. And one of the places that I thought might be interesting to explore, which was, I come from sociology, so Frantz Fanon is the sort of first place you would start here. And I was thinking about the Lord quote that you put up, because my understanding of it was sort of, to put it crudely, like anger is often a rational act. And I think that Fanon sort of says the same thing, but he maybe goes a step further, which is that he says that not only is anger rational, when that is turned into an act of resistance, that can be a moment of consciousness transformation. So it's actually through the throwing of the rock and the hope about a future society, because, so I spent some time in Palestine in 2005, and I remember a lot of the people that I spoke to who it was often very much premeditated organization of civil disobedience, but with the knowledge that it could end up in violence. Certainly violence being perpetrated against you, and you might be throwing a rock. But one of the things that came through from, I think, a lot of the comments, a lot of the people I spoke to, was that like there was still a sense in their mind that like through this, the simple act, they were willing to make self-sacrifice in order for this idea that maybe sometime down in the future, this one small act would contribute to some sort of idea of the possibility of a brighter future. So again, it sort of comes back to this idea of the emotional act being connected to an idea of the future, but it also connected back to the point that the person raised there about it kind of sometimes being, I don't want to say premeditated, but rather organized, I think is a nicer way of putting it. So I was just interested in how you thought about those things, and if you thought about bringing Fanon and sort of engaging in some of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, definitely a great idea to bring Fanon in there. I think I often, in my thinking about resistance and movements, I'm not as interested in the past or the future as I am in the present. And I think that's for a lot of reasons. One of which, I mean, I think in this instance, there is something about the value of the act itself, and I think there's a difference between engaging in an act in a way in which you're hopeful for the future versus engaging in an act when you find the future to be hopeless versus engaging in an act for the significance of what it means to be a community engaging in the act right now. And I think that latter temporality, the presentness of it, that's something I've been sort of, I think, in my work thinking about for a long time. Does resistance have to be future oriented? I don't think it necessarily does. I think the concept of the future, right, is quite a privileged concept. So, yeah, but I need to think through that more. I love that question. I mean, I do think that there's also sometimes we might see a disconnect between something being orchestrated and it engendering particular kinds of emotions. And so if something is orchestrated, perhaps it's less connected to emotion as much as maybe a practice or a ritual. And I don't know that that's the case either. I think that's something that this project will, as I keep moving through and sort of open up as different spaces of all those different kinds of categories of resistant acts that maybe I've taken for granted and others have taken for granted. But yeah, your reminder to return to Fanon is especially useful. Thank you. Sure, Ben.
So I have, I think, two main points. I think I'll start with the more straightforward one. So to put it all on the table. So I am a law professor, so I come as I'm thinking about yourself, thinking about the law, specifically international law. and the right to resistance under international law that gives occupied and colonized people. Sorry, these are on their prescription. So I'm not trying to be some kind of hungover. You look sorry, but I can see you. So, the right to resistance under international law for occupied colonized people, including the right to engage in violence, right, against the occupier or the colonizer, which is obviously very relevant to Palestine, right? Yeah. And so when I think about, you use the phrase, the weapon of the weak, right, or the tool of the weak, which, I don't think is inaccurate, but at the same time, I actually think that it's also important to recognize and understand the ways in which this weapon is also a right, that these individuals have. And both in that sense and in a broader political sense, empowering, right? So it's actually it's a tool of power, right? A way of exhibiting their power. Resistance, right, is a decision, right, made by the resistor to fight back. And that is an empowering experience, right, on a human level and on a collective level, right? So I would encourage you to not just think about it as a tool of the weak, but also as a way in which the quote unquote weak can empower themselves. And I think that also can inform the way you think about the response, right, that is then provided by the occupying force or whoever, right? And I think that response, an important part of that response, and something that I think dictates the severity of the response, has to do with the extent to which the responder, the state actor, sees the rock as an empowering tool, right? So a desire to strip that power away, right, becomes an important part of the reaction, right, that is experienced. The other point, which is way more convoluted, is, this project is super interesting, obviously, but I think, I'm wondering, where does the story begin? What is it, in fact, this notion of back in thousands of years ago, right? The rock was so core, right? The grip was so core to our existence as human beings. Does it start there as this very human experience? Or does it start from a place of politics, right? Where the rock isn't just a tool of survival, but a tool of political action. Yeah. Because I think you kind of need to separate the two to a certain extent, or acknowledge that the experience of using the rock from an emotional standpoint probably might be very, very different, right? Where you're using it as a sort of recreational activity, where it's a survival mechanism, or where it's something that's involved with where politics is involved, And so I think where you start the story really needs to be something that's core to how you think about the entire analysis. Because I think if you start from that very human experience, you may end up in a different place, right? Yeah. Versus starting from, say, Palestine, where, rock throwing wasn't invented, but certainly it takes on, I think, a form at an international and global level, and the response to it also, I think, I'm guessing, shifts versus some other points in time, because of the way the rock becomes an important part of resistance and political action for this, being racialized and oppressed group.
Yeah, no, thank you for all that. I appreciate it. I think, part of and I get various feedback, and I don't know if the Scott framing will stay with the project as I go. It's not like a perfect fit anyway, but it's been a useful way for me to think through kind of the structural positions. And so it's not about that people who throw rocks are weak. It's a structural relationship, right? So I think that's key. And I do think there's something about, the starting point. I think part of there's a way in which the project is about the politics of being human in a certain sense too. So I need to think through that a bit more. I think your framing is really useful for me to kind of parse out a couple of different trajectories. So yeah, I'm going to do some thinking on that. Thank you for the critical engagement. I really appreciate it.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for the talk. I I mean, going back to the idea of using James Scott as, as a framing, but also made me think about the gendered element of rock throwing. You didn't necessarily speak a lot about, what are the women doing necessarily. And also because one of the ways of engaging with Scott's ideas, agency is not just in defiance, it's also in passivity, right?
Yeah.
And so it made me wonder, even within these regimes of violences, what are the women doing? Are they throwing rocks out of resistance? Are they just waiting? The ideas of temporalities and also boredom oftentimes, because violence is not just about like this constant everydayness of violence, it can become very ontological, right? So it sort of made me wonder about the gendered element.
Yeah, I've been thinking about what I want to do with this, and this is one of the conversations I've been having with my research assistant, is to think about the gendered nature, because some of the, like, if you think about it, inevitably there's going to be like a visual analysis piece of this project. Both Professor Olson for some guidance, but because there's all these iconic images, and many of them are young men, but not all of them. In fact, some of the ones that I think to me stick out the most are women. There's this one of this sort of middle-aged woman with her shoes in her hand, throwing a rock, and maybe it's in East Jerusalem or the West Bank. I don't remember for sure where she's at. So there is a gendered piece there for sure, including in the cases on the Mexican-U.S. border. And that is almost starker in some ways, being almost uniformly in response to boys or young men. And so that kind of very active nature of the act, as you say, right? Sort of it's only one piece of the way we can define agency, and also very, very gendered. So I don't know if it's going to be a question of actually centering women at all in the project, or really just centering men and boys and theorizing gender from that.
Yeah, because you talk about also being human, right? Like what the larger project of being human, but also because of these different positionalities that we sort of exist. And oftentimes because resistance is so masculine, oftentimes it's sort of projected as that these other voices sort of get decentered. So I'd love to see how that plays out.
Yeah. I mean, I'm also thinking about like Stonewall, right? He throws the first brick. There's obviously gender and race and sexuality embedded in that as well. So I don't know. There's so many dimensions of this, and I'm still, even though I've been thinking about it forever, I'm still like in the really early stages of like actually digging into the project. So that's really helpful. I think. Thank you for your comment.
We have one question and a comment from our virtual audience. Tab writes, the point shared about rock throwing as resistance makes him think, or they think about what basic technologies are accessible to a populace and cannot be, quote unquote, paywalled, so to speak, hoarded away from a populace and only accessed by state sanctioned means. Tab is curious if this is a vein you'll be exploring within the text, hoarding of technologies along lines of power. And then the comment from Alistair is, such a great narrative from your childhood to Saeed and more. Thanks, rock on. And I'm not sure if Alistair meant the word play, but it is deeply appreciated, obviously, from the audience. So there's that. So
That's a great phrase of hoarding technology. I hadn't really been thinking of those terms, but I think, with the earlier comment about STS and thinking about the dialectical nature of technology, I think, these things for me to be thinking through. So thank you for that.
you do have, yes. I mean, this is tangential. I feel like it relates to the gender comment. What I started thinking about early in your talk, when you're talking about the disproportionate use of force, is that nonviolence is a strategy to address that problem. But I think that nonviolence tends to be very antiseptic emotionally. And so, just for thought.
That's really, interesting.
So Carma, I owe you a
deep bound gratitude for introducing this word ball. And I was thinking about the floating signifier of the rock.
Yeah.
So going back to 2015 here in Madison, it was presumed that Tony Robinson had to have had a rock for the presence of the police officer who murdered him. But then the rock became us and our voices of protest that evening and in the months that followed. Now we know that in order for the presence of police to continue to be funded in our societies, that rock must inevitably be present, right? And so this idea of what does that look like in terms of resistance? Foucault said that their resistance and the power go together. They're inextricably connected. And so what does that mean? Nowadays, the rock might be your educational email. The rock might be your nation of citizenry. It might be any number of different floating signifiers. So I wanted to say that that's prompted some deeper reflection in me. And thank you very much.
I love that. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that reminder.
Camera. Yeah. And it's yeah, it could be your camera. You take me.
Totally. Yeah.
Well, this may almost seem like a silly question, but have you consulted with any rocks about?
I mean, it's actually a great question.
Well, I guess what I was thinking, they're things, right? And so, but their shape can affect so you mentioned the influence of the rock on skipping.
Yes.
Right. So the rock has the influence there, but you're also talking about rock things wielded by people who are treated as things. And maybe kind of breaking into the consciousness of the other side, right? That it may experience that person's subjectivity as trauma. So that's a lot.
I love that. I don't have a good answer to that because I consulted with Rod's no thought about that, but I think it's really important, especially as we're thinking about energy and kind of the post-humanism and animacy objects and part of our ecosystems. There's a lot there. Yeah, thank you for the prompt.
Sure.
Professor Rolls.
I have two questions to choose your own adventure. Just answer one of them.
Miranda, let me choose your own adventure.
One is about rage and human community. And I feel like we so often experience those as a choice that excludes the other one.
Yeah.
And I know you don't think of them that way. And I'd love to just hear you talk about it. The other is maybe a disciplinary question. I'm thinking about the grip clubbing and the holding of a pencil or a pen. I'm thinking about our own field's fetishization of language and rational thought and careful argument as an alternative to violence.
Right.
And sort of that, so thinking as a rhetorician for a second about Snaper.
Yeah. Yeah. And then of course you get the, critiques of that rhetoric itself is just inherently violent, right? But yeah, that's actually really cool. I hadn't really been thinking about the kind of the grip itself and the way the different objects. And so what is that relationship to rhetoric? I mean, I've been trying to think about material.
Edward Corbett, like the open hand and the closed fist.
Yeah. Which I've written some about elsewhere, right? And
racist essays.
So that's that's fun for me to put that in conversation. Why I hadn't, I don't know. But thank you for that. And I think your first comment is right. I mean, I think there's this, especially right now. I mean, how many of our communities are born of rage? I mean, real deep rage, right? And about what's happening in the world, what's happening, in our backyards. And I think it's an interesting moment to think about the emotional contours of community, but also what good our feelings are at all right now.
Yeah.
Right. At least I've been thinking about that.
Well, I keep thinking about it as the return to community. Like the thing that our emotions are good for anyways right now is returning to people. So
Yeah.
I think we all kind of felt that when you did that at the end.
Yeah. What's the goal? Some good. Yeah. Thanks, Chris.